There is a particular smell to boot polish at 11 o'clock at night. Waxy, chemical, faintly sweet. If you've spent any real time in the British Army, that smell is so embedded in your memory that it can pull you backward through a decade in under a second. I was sitting on the floor of my room in the barracks, a cloth wrapped around 2 fingers, working it into the leather in slow circles, when my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Are you all right, love?" I put the phone face down and kept polishing. My name is Robert Ashworth. People call me Rob except my grandmother, who called me Robbie until the day she died, and my commanding officer, who calls me Ashworth, and Danny, who mostly doesn't call me anything because Danny communicates primarily through silence and the occasional single syllable deployed at maximum precision. I'm from Wolverhampton. I joined the Army at 19 because I had a grade C in geography, a vague sense that I wanted to do something that mattered, and absolutely no idea what that something was. That was 11 years ago. I'm a guardsman with the Grenadier Guards. I've done 2 tours. I've stood ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace more times than I can count. I thought I knew what this job asked of you. I was wrong about that. It took 4 days in September 2022 to show me exactly how wrong. The boots, by the way, were already immaculate. I knew that. I was polishing them again anyway, which tells you something about the state I was in before the assignment even began. There are things you do when you're trying to keep your hands busy so your mind doesn't go somewhere you're not ready for it to go. Polishing boots is mine. It always has been. I did 3 coats that night. The leather ended up looking like dark glass. I set them by the door, turned the light off, and lay on top of my bed in the dark for a long time before sleep came. The briefing happened 2 days after the announcement. 40 of us in a room that smelled of floor cleaner and old coffee, seated in rows, the way you sit when something formal is about to be said. Our commanding officer, a man called Major Hendricks, who I have never once seen express anything resembling an emotion on his face, stood at the front with a single sheet of paper. He read it the way he reads everything, evenly, without inflection, as though the words were logistics, which I suppose, from a certain angle, they were. Selected units from the Grenadier, Coldstream, Scots, Irish, and Welsh Guards would form the vigil at Westminster Hall. The Queen would lie in state for 4 days. Rotations would be 20 minutes in duration at the 4 corners of the catafalque in full ceremonial dress, silent, motionless, around the clock. He paused, he looked at the sheet, then at us. The public, he said, would be present throughout. The queue was expected to reach several miles in length, hundreds of thousands of people over the course of the 4 days. We were to be, in his words, a visible and dignified presence representing the armed forces' respect and duty to the crown. He folded the paper once. That was the briefing. Nobody asked questions. There's a kind of briefing where questions would feel wrong, not because you'd be reprimanded for asking them, but because the silence afterward is already doing the work. This was one of those. We filed out. In the corridor, Danny fell into step beside me. He's been doing that for 3 years, just appearing at my shoulder without announcement, as though he'd been there the whole time and I'd only just noticed. He said nothing for the length of the corridor. Then, as we reached the stairwell, he said, 20 minutes is a long time. Yeah, I said. He nodded. We went upstairs. That was the whole conversation. At the time, I thought he was talking about the physical difficulty of standing motionless for 20 minutes in full ceremonial dress, which is genuinely not a small thing. Bearskin, tunic, the whole construction. Your body finds ways to argue with you after about 90 seconds. Later, I understood he wasn't talking about that at all. My grandmother's name was Patricia. Everyone called her Pat. She grew up in a back-to-back terrace in Bilston, one of 6 children, and she could tell you the exact date of every significant event in the royal family's history going back to before the war because she considered it part of being British in the same way she considered knowing how to make a proper cup of tea part of being British. Not performative, just woven in. She watched the coronation in 1953 on a neighbor's television set because nobody in the street owned one yet. She was 11 years old. She described it to me once when I was about 8, sitting in her kitchen while she made sandwiches, and the detail she remembered most clearly was not the crown, not the abbey, not the ceremony itself. It was the moment, she said, when it was over and the street outside erupted, and she realized that everyone around her had been holding their breath for the same reason she had, and that doing something like that together, all of you, all at once, meant something she didn't have a word for. She died in 2019. She never met the Queen. She never came close to meeting the Queen. That wasn't the point. The point was that for 81 years, the Queen had simply been there, a fixed coordinate in my grandmother's world, a consistency in a life that had plenty of inconsistency in it. My grandfather's early death, moving house 4 times, the slow grinding difficulties of a working-class life in the Midlands across 8 decades. And through all of it, there was this constant, this presence that didn't waver. I thought about this on the bus from the barracks. I was in civilian clothes, traveling separately, looking out at London going about its business in that strange, muted way it had adopted since the announcement. Flags at half-mast, a shop window with a handwritten card in it, a man on the pavement reading something on his phone with an expression I recognized but couldn't name. I thought Nan would have something to say about where I'm going right now. I thought I wish I could tell her. Then I looked back out at the city and kept that to myself. The way you keep most things when you've spent 11 years in an institution that considers emotional expression a personal matter, best conducted in private. My boots were in a bag at my feet. I'd polished them again that morning. Nothing prepares you for the queue. I knew it was long. We'd been told it was long. The figures were in the briefing notes, the projected numbers, the logistical arrangements. Numbers are abstract. Standing in Westminster Hall and seeing what 250,000 people across 4 days actually looks like when it moves slowly past a coffin in near silence, that is not abstract in any way. They came in every configuration grief comes in, alone and in pairs, in family groups. Elderly parents shepherded gently by adult children who were crying harder than the parents. People in their 80s who remembered the coronation, who remembered exactly what my grandmother remembered, and who had clearly been unable to think of anywhere else they were supposed to be right now. Young people who surprised me, not because I thought they wouldn't care, but because the rawness of it on their faces was something I hadn't expected. Children who didn't fully understand, and were being very quiet anyway, because the room told them to be. The hall itself does something to sound. It's been standing for 900 years and it holds silence the way very old stone holds cold completely from the inside. When you're in it, even with thousands of people moving through, the noise never rises above a certain register. It stays low, almost below hearing, footsteps, the occasional contained sob, the rustle of a program being folded. My first rotation was the afternoon of the first day. I took my position at the corner of the catafalque, foot drill precise and rehearsed. I came to a halt. I fixed my eyes at the middle distance, the trained gaze that looks at everything and registers nothing or is supposed to. My hands were behind my back. My shoulders were back. My breathing was controlled and even. And then a woman walked past, who looked so much like my grandmother that my throat closed completely. She was perhaps 75, small, wearing a green coat. She had the same way of moving, careful and deliberate, that my grandmother had in her last years. She stopped for a moment across from me, looked at the coffin, and pressed her lips together in an expression I know how to read because I watched it on my grandmother's face many times. It's the expression of someone who is not going to cry because they've decided not to, and the decision is costing them something. She moved on. I kept my gaze fixed. My face did not change. But something behind it did, and I spent the remaining 17 minutes of that rotation keeping it exactly where it was. Here is what I know about Danny Pierce. He's from a village outside Durham that I've never been able to find on a map, which he finds quietly amusing. He joined the Guards at 18. He supports Sunderland, which he considers a matter of private suffering rather than public identity. He can strip and reassemble a rifle faster than anyone I've served with. He has a sister called Bev who sends him biscuits every few weeks in a tin with a picture of a cat on it, and he shares them without being asked, and without making anything of it. He does not talk about feelings, not because he doesn't have them. I've been certain of that for years, but because he comes from a place, geographically and personally, where feelings are a structural element, present and load-bearing, but not something you discuss while the roof is still up. On the evening of the second day, we were in the small holding area off the main hall, waiting for our rotation. The kind of waiting that happens in ceremonial duty is different from other kinds of waiting. You can't move much. You can't check your phone. You exist in a kind of suspended state, held at attention by the nearness of something important. Danny was standing beside me. He'd been polishing the buttons on his tunic with his thumb, which he does when he's thinking. He said without looking at me, "My dad watched her on the telly every Christmas." I said, "Yeah." Every year, never missed it, didn't matter what was happening. 3:30 he was in his chair. "Mine too," I said, "my Nan." He nodded. He kept working his thumb across the button. "Feels strange," he said, "standing here." "It does." "Good strange," he said, "I think." I thought about that for a moment. "Yeah," I said, "good strange." That was all. Our rotation was called. We walked out, took our positions, and stood for 20 minutes in silence beside the coffin of a woman neither of our families had ever met, and both of our families had mourned genuinely when she died. There is something in that I still don't have the right word for. The 3 a.m. slot came up on the third night. I won't say I'd been dreading it, because that implies I'd been thinking clearly enough to dread specific things. And by the third night, I was running on about 4 hours of sleep per 24, which is enough to keep the body functional, but does interesting things to the mind's ability to maintain its usual arrangements. Westminster Hall at 3 a.m. is a different place. The public queue pauses in the early hours. The hall is maintained, staffed, watched, but not filled. There were perhaps 30 people in the space when I took my position. The lighting, which during the day exists in relationship to daylight from the high windows, becomes total at night. The spotlights above the coffin are the only warm light in the room. Everything else is shadow. The coffin sits on its catafalque with the imperial state crown at its head, the orb and scepter arranged with it, all of them catching the light in a way that is almost too much to look at and also impossible not to. The flowers placed by the family are there, the royal standard, and over everything, that silence, that 900-year-old stone silence that presses down gently and completely. I have stood guard in a lot of places across my career. I've done it in conditions that were difficult in more obvious ways: heat, cold, rain, the particular discomfort of dress uniform in summer. But I have never stood anywhere that required as much of me as that hall at 3 in the morning. Because there was nowhere to put your eyes that didn't ask you something. You look at the coffin and you think about what a life is, not abstractly, specifically. 96 years, 70 of them as the monarch of a nation, the head of a commonwealth, a figure whose face was on every stamp, every coin, the background of every formal photograph taken in every government building and school and civic space in the country for the entirety of your own lifetime and your parents' lifetimes. A person who was, in some way that you couldn't fully account for, simply part of the architecture of the world you grew up in. And now she was in a box in a room where I was standing guard, and outside, hundreds of thousands of people were sleeping briefly before coming back to queue for miles to spend 30 seconds walking past her, because they didn't know what else to do with what they were feeling. And neither, if I was honest with myself at 3 in the morning in the dark, did I. My grandmother used to say, "You don't know what holds a thing up until it isn't there anymore." She was talking about something else at the time, a wall they'd knocked through in her kitchen, But standing there in that ancient silence, I thought about it differently. I kept my position, I kept my face still, I did my 20 minutes. Walking back through the corridor afterward, I stopped at a window and looked at the Thames for a moment, very dark below, the city lights catching it in broken pieces. Then I straightened up and went to find Danny. He was awake. He handed me a biscuit from Bev's tin. The cat on the lid was Ginger. Neither of us said anything. I ate the biscuit. It was a bourbon. I don't particularly like bourbons. It was exactly what I needed. London before dawn on September 19th was the quietest I have ever heard it. I've been in this city in the early hours many times. It is never truly silent. There's always the infrastructure of it running underneath, the buses on their first routes, the distant machinery of a place that never completely stops. But that morning, standing outside the barracks at 5:15 in full ceremonial dress, the bearskin already on, the air cold and perfectly still, the usual background noise of the city seemed to have been turned down by something. As though London itself was holding the same breath the whole country was holding. The streets were already lined. Not close to the route, out here in our vicinity, but you could feel the direction of it. The way a crowd has a gravity that bends the air around it even from a distance. People had slept on pavements. They'd come the day before and simply stayed, wrapped in sleeping bags and Union Jacks, and the particular determined grief of people who needed to be somewhere when something happened and couldn't explain why in words that sounded proportionate. I understood it completely. I dressed slowly and with attention, the way you dress when you want the act of dressing to hold you together rather than just clothe you. Each part of the uniform in order. The tunic, each button checked. The white gloves. The boots, which I'd polished for the 4th time at 4:30 that morning, sitting on the edge of my bed in the lamplight, cloth in hand, going through the motion that my hands know how to do without instruction. Danny appeared in the doorway just as I finished. He looked at the boots, he looked at me. "You've done those again," he said. "Yeah." He considered this. He was already fully dressed somehow, because Danny is always already fully dressed. It's one of the more inexplicable things about him. "Rob," he said. I looked up. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way he does when words are being assembled somewhere behind his eyes, and he's not sure if they'll make it out in a useful form. Then he said, "She'd have been well proud of you, your Nan." I looked back down at the boots. "Yeah," I said after a moment, "I think she would have." He nodded once. He turned and went back into the corridor. I sat there for another 30 seconds. Then I stood up, settled the bearskin on my head, and walked out to meet the day. The procession through London is something I will not try to describe completely, because I don't have the language for all of it, and I'd rather say that plainly than reach for words that don't fit. I will say this, the crowds. Hundreds of thousands of people pressed together along the route, and the sound they made was unlike any crowd sound I have experienced before. Crowds at football matches, crowds at protests, crowds at concerts, they all have a pulse to them, an energy that oscillates and builds. This crowd was different. This was the sound of people being completely still together, the occasional sob rising briefly before being absorbed back into the silence, the rustle of a flag lowered in a private gesture. And underneath all of it, just the footsteps of the procession and the rhythm of the drums, slow and even, like something being measured. The coffin moved through all of it on its gun carriage, the crown catching the September light, and I watched faces in the crowd as I moved in the procession, because I couldn't not. An old man in a wheelchair with his eyes closed and his lips moving slightly, as though he was saying something he'd been saving up. A woman holding a child up on her hip so the child could see, the woman's face completely open and undone. A teenage boy standing at the very front of the barriers, who was trying very hard not to cry, and was not entirely succeeding, and clearly found this mortifying, and couldn't leave anyway. I know that feeling. I recognized it like a face. My role during the service at Westminster Abbey was to stand stationed, still, present. I was not inside the Abbey. I was positioned outside, part of the wider ceremonial structure, which means what I experienced of the service itself came through the broadcast playing faintly through an earpiece and through the quality of the silence that emanated from the building itself. I heard the hymns distantly. I heard the address. I heard, at one point, what I can only describe as the sound of 2,000 people breathing together in the same moment of feeling. And at the front of the crowd barrier nearest to me, placed carefully against the stone, a small bunch of flowers that someone had left that morning. Pink carnations, hand-tied with a piece of white ribbon, a small card tucked into them that I couldn't read from where I stood. I looked at those flowers for a long time. Small, ordinary, completely insufficient as a gesture, and completely right for exactly that reason. The committal service was at Windsor. St. George's Chapel sits in the castle, precincts the way something that has been exactly where it belongs for 600 years sits, settled, certain of its own purpose, its stonework the color of old bone in the afternoon light. The day had been overcast through the morning and cleared by afternoon, one of those September skies that manages to be bright without being warm, the light thin and precise as a blade. I was part of the guard positioned in the chapel precincts during the committal service. Inside, the senior clergy, the family, the most senior dignitaries. Outside us, a wider ring of ceremonial but unreachable, standing at attention in the pale light while history moved through a building 30 meters away. There is a thing called the stick of office, a phrase called the breaking of the wand, traditions of the Lord Chamberlain that date back further than anyone can properly account for. The moment when the formal symbols of service to a monarch are surrendered, when the relationship between a sovereign and the instruments of their reign is formally, finally, concluded. I'd been briefed on the order of service. I knew what was coming. The imperial state crown would be removed from the coffin, the orb, the scepter, placed on the altar. The coffin beneath them no longer would be lowered. Knowing what is coming and standing inside it are not the same thing. I heard it before I saw it, or rather I felt the quality of the silence inside change, the way you can feel a barometric shift before a storm. The air making a small adjustment that the body registers before the mind does. And then through the open door of the chapel, visible from where I was positioned at the precise angle I was positioned, I saw it happen. The Lord Chamberlain's hands, white gloves, the crown lifted carefully with the gravity of someone handling something that means more than any object should logically be able to mean. Lifted from the coffin's surface where it had rested for 4 days, where I had stood beside it at 3 in the morning in the oldest silence I'd ever been inside, where hundreds of thousands of people had filed past and pressed their lips together and carried their unnamable feelings and placed their flowers and gone back to the world changed in ways they probably couldn't yet measure. The crown was placed on the altar, and what happened to me in that moment was not visible. I want to be absolutely clear about that. My face did not change. My posture did not change. My eyes stayed fixed and my breathing stayed even and my hands stayed clasped behind my back. And from any external perspective, I was exactly what I was supposed to be. A guardsman on duty, present and correct and professional. A fixed point of dignity in a moment of national significance. But something inside, something I had been holding with both hands for 4 days, rigid and controlled and carefully managed through every rotation and every night shift and every sleepless early hour and every face in the queue that broke me in ways I didn't let show. That thing finally, in the space of one breath, let go. Not dramatically, not with any of the release that the word suggests, more like a knot that has been under tension for so long that when it loosens, the loosening itself is a sensation you have to learn to understand. Something opening in the chest, a pressure you'd stopped noticing because it had been there so long, suddenly, quietly, absent. I thought of my grandmother watching a television set in a neighbor's house in Bilston in 1953, a street full of people holding their breath for the same reason she was. I thought of Danny's father in his chair at half, past 3 every Christmas day without fail. I thought of the woman in the green coat pressing her lips together. I thought of the pink carnations against the stone. The crown sat on the altar. The coffin was lowered. The final prayers were said. The pipe major played a lament that climbed the stone walls of the chapel and stayed there, hanging in the air above us long after the notes themselves had ended. And I stood at attention in the September light and did the only thing that was mine to do. I stayed. We were back at barracks by early evening. The buses, the logistics, the formal dispersal, all of it handled with the same efficient quiet that the whole operation had been handled with. You change out of ceremonial uniform with the attention it requires. You store it correctly. You follow the routine, because routine is the thing that holds the shape of you when you don't have the energy to hold it yourself. I sat on the edge of my bed. Boots off, set them by the wall, sat there in my socks and my shirt sleeves in the quiet of a room that felt very ordinary after 4 days of being inside something that was very much not. The light was on. Someone down the corridor was laughing at something on their phone. Outside, a car went past. Normal sounds doing the work of bringing you back. I didn't know how long I'd been sitting there when Danny came in. He didn't knock because Danny doesn't knock. He just arrives, and you've stopped expecting anything different 3 years in. He came in, sat on his own bed across from me and put his hands on his knees. He was still in his shirt. He'd taken his boots off too, I noticed. He'd placed them very precisely side by side at the foot of his bed. He sat there for a long time. I sat there. The corridor sounds came and went. A door closed somewhere. The heating made its usual noise, the system in this building that has never worked quite right, and that we've all stopped reporting because there's a form for it, and the form goes somewhere and nothing changes. Outside the window, the sky had gone properly dark. London doing what London does in the evening, putting its lights on one by one and getting on with things, the way it always has, the way it was getting on with things before any of us were here and will be after. Danny looked at his hands. He turned them over once as though checking something. He looked back up. And then he said, very quietly, in the voice he uses for the things that actually matter, "We did all right by her, Rob." I looked at the boots by the wall, my boots, still dark as glass. "Yeah," I said. "We did." And that was it. That was all there was. No elaboration, no ceremony, no further words to explain or expand or resolve what 4 days had put in us. Just that. Just, "We did all right by her." Said by a man from County Durham who communicates in single syllables and shares his sister's biscuits without making anything of it, and who had stood beside me in a 900-year-old silence and understood, without either of us ever saying so, exactly what we were both carrying. I nodded once. He nodded back. We sat there a while longer, in the ordinary light of an ordinary room, while outside London went on being London, and somewhere a pipe major's lament was still climbing stone walls in a chapel in Windsor, or felt like it was, or always would be. My grandmother would have had something to say about all of it, something practical and precise and probably delivered while making tea. I didn't know what exactly. I just knew it would have been right. She usually was. I left the boots where they were. For the first time in 4 days, I didn't polish them again. Robert Ashworth served with the Grenadier Guards for 14 years. He lives in Birmingham. He still polishes his boots on the nights when sleep doesn't come easily, which is more nights than he'll admit to.